aakalain mong perpekto ang lahat kung hindi mo titingnan sa ibang anggulo. Araw-araw kong pinagmamasdan ang paligid. Walang nagbabago. Tanaw ng aking mga mata mula sa aking bintana ang mga kadungisang nangyayari, pagpatak ng dilim. Ganito na nga ba ang sitwasyon sa mundo? May mangingikil at may magtatago. Kailan maaalis ang panyo sa mga mata niyong nakapiring? Ang katawan ko ba ay sa akin o sa inyo na rin?
It all started from a toxic and childish relationship I had back in 2018. And not only did it happen once, but numerous times all throughout the relationship until 2021. There were times that we were just hanging out, having fun, doing things that normal teenagers do. Then the next thing I knew was it happened again and again. It was, and it even came to a point to wherein I expected to happen. Public places such as the school, the park, the mall, certain dark alleyways, you name it. Several friends' houses are definitely a part of the list, and even my own home. It was sexual assault turned into sexual coercion. It can make you think you owe those non-consensual things. His forceful actions and remarks turned into threats.
Symbolic interactionism and psychoanalysis go hand in hand together, especially if used as a lens to see through sexuality and consent. Using such perspectives, we can identify and relate violence and dominance of a certain gender, superiority of one over the other, and consent and complicity that are seen in everyday interactions, social practices, institutional processes, and dispositions. However, students like us lack professional knowledge and experience, hence why we reached out to two different prospective individuals, a psychology graduate and a PhD holder in sociology. Together, they will give us astute explanations for heavily related questions in the said certain fields. For a brief background about them, first we have Miss Jelena May Alachong, a graduate of Bachelor of Science in Psychology and a registered psychometrician whom answered via chat. While the next is Miss Rachel Aquino with a Bachelor of Arts degree in Sociology, Masters in Public Administration, and Doctorate in Philippine Studies with the profession of Conflict Resolution Practitioner. Fortunately, circumstances allowed us to meet via Zoom call with Mr. Vinluan as the interviewer.
Question number 1. What is your perspective on sexual relationship as a power symbols? For instance, men seen as more superior than women. We live in a modernized world where the current generation eagerly breaks the customs, stereotypes, and constraints imposed predominantly on women and queers. Sexual relations are one of them, wherein males are supposed to initiate and act recklessly towards the topic. However, through the lens of experts and even students like us, these traditions are slowly revolutionizing to apply to all genders. Still, it is only forming, changing, and people are still fighting for their rights. This is why we sought for more opinions and answers to different forms of studies. In a psychology graduate interview, living in a modern society, I think this Asian perspective about men having the dominant power in a relationship is not that applicable nowadays. Seeing how empowered women excel in different aspects of life while still being able to nurture the family, I think this power is now equally distributed.
Now, from a BA Sociology graduate's perspective, here's a call from Miss Rachel.
So for the first question po is, what is your perspective on sexual relationship as power symbols? For instance, men seen as more superior than women.
Men and women are not yet equal in the current societal conception as it is prevailing now. But if the men and women are not gender sensitive, then men would make the assumption of what society's perception of their power relations would be, which is predominated by conceptions of patriarchy, meaning men as more superior and powerful than women. But if men and women are both gender sensitive, then sexual relationships could be equitably fulfilling for both parties. So that is what is missing in most relationships, no? The gender sensitivity aspect.
Question number 2. How do you think nurturing from childhood affects one's perspective about sex and consent? Childhood environment shape a child's perspective about sexual consent and awareness. What is taught or experienced by a child during their youth will likely be brought up until adulthood. How sex and consent are viewed in the environment and how it is taught during childhood will shape the child's ideas and perspective of the matter. In the article, Teaching Sexual Health, parents can influence a child's mindset on sexual consent. Parents help their children to understand the meaning of having their own consent and rights towards their own bodies, which structurize their psychic structures in the unconscious mind. Furthermore, the child's personal experience regarding sex and consent significantly impacts their perspective. With regards to this, there are other factors also present, as our psychology graduate interviewee explains that building a healthy and strong parent-child emotional relationship during childhood can affect one's perspective about sex and consent if and only if sex education is discussed openly in the family. Despite having a nurtured childhood, if there is no enough information about sex education, the child might still have the wrong idea about sex and consent.
Now, from a BA Sociology graduate, here's the perspective of Miss Rachel.
Second question po, Ma'am Jen. How do you think nurturing from childhood affects one's perspective about sex and consent?
Children are socialized by the adults around them on what their perspective about sex and consent are. So parents and caregivers transmit their views on sexuality to the child and greatly influence their views on gender dynamics. So things such as how certain tasks are assigned. O ikaw, maglalaba ka. Ikaw, aalaga ka ng aso. For boys and girls, socialize them into gender stereotyping. This connects to sex and consent. The perception that men are strong and women are weak strengthens the child's views that women should be under the power of men and that they should just consent to the men's sexual advances.
What is sexual relations from a psychoanalytic point of view? Most people have a narrow understanding of sexuality in a psychoanalytic perspective. Oftentimes, it is poorly reduced to men wanting to sleep with their mother and to women wanting penises, when in fact, Sigmund Freud's psychoanalytic theory goes well beyond that misconception. Sexuality from a psychoanalytic point of view refers to pleasure in the broad sense of the term. What are the sources of pleasure, and how do human beings act to obtain it? One of Freud's most important discoveries, infantile sexuality, tries to answer these questions by looking back into our early childhood. He says that pleasure is introduced to a person through stimulating different parts of the body, such as pleasures linked to eating, defecating, being touched, or any other physical care that we may give to infants. The way these pleasures are sufficiently satisfied or not will have consequences in the development of pleasure-seeking and displeasure-avoiding in the future adult. This means that childhood experiences may directly or indirectly reflect how we see sex, how we behave towards it, and how tolerable we are to the act of consent. For example, one might see consent as unneeded due to the fact that their caretakers have never asked them for consent as a child. According to an interview that we conducted with a psychology graduate, on a psychoanalytic view, sexuality is the main driving force of an individual. It also assumes that sexuality has components throughout the body, and it originates back to much earlier in childhood than it was commonly thought to emerge.
From a perspective of a psychology graduate, sex education teaches young people and children about their bodies, reproductive health, sexuality, and most especially their rights and consent. These topics are crucial and very essential to protect oneself from violence and harassment. Bringing these to awareness will make it easier for them to understand that sexual abuse is wrong and for them to easily seek help if they need it. Feeding them with the right information about their right to be safe and learning to respect the differences of other people is imperative in preventing violence to happen. Therefore, in my opinion, sex education is vital in alleviating rape and other sexual exploitation.
For the fourth question po, in your opinion, do you think sex education the key in minimizing rape and other sexual violence and harassment?
Sex education is just one aspect. A more important key is gender sensitivity, the changing of mindsets from a culture of patriarchy to that of equality between the sexes. Rape, sexual violence, and sexual harassment is about having power and having control over another person. So, That is the heart of gender sensitivity. It's about power relations. So, sex education is good, okay? But that alone will not minimize rape and other forms of sexual violence.
From the mouth-boggling questions we had prepared, perspectives about sexual awareness and consent, both from the view of a psychologist, graduate, and sociologist, may differ in manners and approach. Still, it is no mystery to all that this portion falls within the conclusion where external symbols throughout childhood to adulthood, leading to the stereotypical customs affect the idea of consent in both sexes. Hence, the suggested idea to alleviate this conception of superiority is gender sensitivity and advanced education about sex and consent even in the early stages of childhood. With this, we who stand by the objective to clear violence, misconceptions, and condensations towards sexuality and consent yearn to educate young minds to produce a gender-sensitive future for the next generations.
Relating sexuality and sexual behavior to the family unit as it is the most integral component in society, they maintain a strict focus on it at all times and argue in favor of social arrangements that promote and ensure family preservation. Internalizing the things to consider first before voicing out what you have in mind to the receiving end is what matters the most. The belief that society is made up of interconnected parts that work in harmony to ensure stability, promote balance, and social equilibrium is referred to as functionalism. Without understanding how this works, communication is jeopardized, and both parties are expected to suffer the consequences. You wouldn't know what to prioritize, there are no steps to be taken, there are no structures to check, there are no rules to be followed. What are you hoping to achieve with all of these glitches? Chaos.
When it comes to sexuality, social norms have been shaping ideologies about how it should be viewed since the beginning of time, with a focus on the relationship between social structure and sexual orientation. Homosexuality cannot be used as an acceptable substitute for heterosexuality, because from a functionalist perspective, it appears to cause societal dysfunction on a larger scale. It demonstrates how sexual behavior affects and regulates social stability. People express their sexuality in a variety of ways, and structural functionalism takes the position that family is the most important element of society, with sexuality in the traditional way of viewing it coming in second. As a result, some people have a difficult time openly expressing and showing their sexuality because apparently the social norms of how social stability comes from the awareness that sexual activities should be in and remain through a familial marriage. These criticisms have a tunnel vision and clearly affect a person's freedoms of sexual expression. As long as social norms revolve around this grandstanding, sexuality will be at the center of societal threats. Dumako naman tayo sa pantayong pananaw kung saan tatalakayin ang sexual health awareness and consent sa makabansang konteksto.
Hunyo 26, parada ng mga gumugunita ng Pride Month sa bayan ng San Pablo. Dito, makikita mo kung gaano katanyag ang paghahanap ng kaayusan sa sistemang nagsimula ng nakabaluktot. Makikita mo ang mga miyembro ng LGBTQ+ community na iminagayway ang kanilang watawat. Ito ay upang ipamalas ang kanilang kasarian na kanilang lubos na ipinagmamalaki. Sa kabilang dako, makikita mo naman ang mga kababaihang nagpapahiwatig ng pagmamay-ari sa kanilang katawan. Hawak-hawak nila ang mga karatolang may nakasulat na "She Decides". Ang mga kilusang ito ay epekto ng ilang dekadang pag-agrabyado sa karapatang iginawad sa mga taong ito.
Okay, go ahead.
Sa akin po, ang itatanong ko is about pantayong pananaw and ang topic po nito is sexual health awareness in the Philippine context. So, we will talk about freedom of expression and ano po sa tingin niyo po ang nagiging hadlang din po sa pag-express ng kabataan, lalo na ng LGBT community, ng kanilang sarili at kanilang mga pananaw.
Ang pinakamalaking hadlang sa LGBTQ+ community sa paghahayag ng kanilang mga sarili ay ang diskriminasyon laban sa kanila, LGBTQ at pati na rin sa mga babae. Muli, malaki ang ambag ng mga simbahan at eskwelahan tungkol sa isyong ito. Kung ito ay ituturo ng mga ministro, pari, madre at mga taong simbahan, ang paggalang at pagkilala sa mga LGBTQ, malaking at sa mga babae, malaking ambag ito sa pagsasawala ng diskriminasyon.
Sa kontekstong Pilipino, ang sexual health awareness katulad ng sex education ay bihirang mapag-usapan at minsan ay iniiwasan pa.
Sa obserbasyon niyo po at pag-aaral or research, ano po ang kalagayan ng sexual health awareness sa Pilipinas? Malaya po ba itong napag-uusapan?
Hindi mo mapaghihiwalay ang sexual health sa reproductive health. Ang issue ng sexual and reproductive health na hindi mo maipaghihiwalay ay hindi pa malayang napag-uusapan sa Pilipinas dahil sa paghadlang ng mga simbahan. Malakas pa rin ang pangangampanya ng mga simbahan laban sa sexual at reproductive health issue. Ito sa tingin ko ang pinakamalaking balakid na ating kinakaharap pagdating sa issue ito.
Ayon sa pag-aaral ni Alquilia at Habitan na pinamagatang How Filipino Adolescents Communicate with Their Parents and Vice Versa, topics about sexual behavior and reproductive health, ang kabataan, kanilang mga magulang, kasamahan at iba pang mga kabahagi sa lipunan ay nahihirapan sa pakikipagtalastasan kaugnay sa usaping sexualidad at kalusugang reproduktibo. Dahil dito, hindi natatalakay ang usaping consent at pagtanggap sa iba't ibang klase ng sexualidad.
So, ang third question naman po natin is sa family setting, since nabanggit niyo po kanina na conflict resolution practitioner po kayo. Ano pong madalas nagiging conflict sa pagkakaroon ng expression at malayang talakayan ng sex education, family planning, and sexual liberation sa pamilya po?
Pinakamalaking hadlang ang relihiyon at ang kawalan ng sexual education mismo ng mga nakatatanda para malaya itong mapag-usapan kasama ang mga kabataan. Yun yung obserbasyon ko sa ngayon.
Sa paksang stigma, malaki rin ang impluwensya ng mga magulang sa kanilang mga anak. Batay sa thesis na isinagawa ni Cleophas ng St. Paul University, Manila tungkol sa ethical consent behavior of Filipino parents towards sexual health research for minors, tinutukoy dito na ang behavior ng kabataan patungo sa pagtanggap sa usaping sex education, family planning, at sexual liberation ay naaayon sa attitude at social norms na kinaramihan nila.
Hanggat hindi nagiging bukas na usapin ang sexual health awareness sa ating bansa, hindi magkakaroon ng sapat na kaalaman ang mga susunod na henerasyon tungkol sa consent, pagtanggap sa lahat ng kasarian, sexual violence at discrimination. Lalo't higit sa pagbibigay ng karapatan sa mga miyembro ng lipunan na maging malaya sa pagpili ng makakabuti at nakakapagsasaya sa sarili. Isang solusyon dito ay ang pagpasa at pagkakaroon ng maayos na implementasyon ng sexual orientation and gender identity expression o mas kilala sa tawag na SOGI, and Equality Bill o kilala rin sa tawag na Anti-Discrimination Bill.
And ayun po, yung sa last question po natin, ito po ay bilang sociologist or may degree po kayo in sociology. Ano po ang masasabi ninyo sa susunod na henerasyon ng mga Pilipinong sociologist o mga nais maging sociologist po tulad nyo pagdating sa pagsasagawa ng pananaliksik sa sexual awareness para po maging aware po yung mga susunod na henerasyon?
Ang aking ipapayo sa mga susunod na mananaliksik na henerasyon ay magkaroon or mag-aral na magkaroon ng gender lens o ang paggamit ng lente ng kasarian pagdating sa pag-aaral tungkol sa sexual health awareness. Sa ganitong pamamaraan, mas maiintindihan yung gender dynamics o yung pag-inog ng mga relasyon sa pagitan ng mga babae, lalaki at LGBTQ at paano nito naaapektuhan ang kanilang mga relasyon kabilang na ang sexual health, sexual violence at iba pa.
Mahalagang pag-aralan ng mga modernong mag-aaral ng Pilipinas ang mga paksang ito sa kontekstong pantayo, sapagkat itong usaping ito ay hindi lang basta mababaw na issue, kung hindi isa itong suliranin na nararapat solusyonan at ayusin. Ang ating lipunan ay may malaking pangangailangan sa mga malalim na pananaliksik tungkol sa sexual health awareness na angkop sa ating kultura, kasaysayan, kaugalian at pananaw.
Well, I'm a conflict resolution practitioner, no? And conflict theory has focused on power relations among actors, whether men or women. What is missing is a gender lens. As a conflict resolution practitioner, what I see that is needed is to make the roles of men and women visible in order to understand the different ways they are involved and affected by conflict, and also to examine the ways in which gender roles, the relations between men and women are changing during conflict situations. The problem of sexual harassment and violence intensify during conflict situations. This is because women become more vulnerable and men see conflicts as an issue of dominance. So that is from a conflict resolution practitioner's perspective. I would say that sexual harassment is experienced by all genders now, but the numbers are still skewed against the favor of women. Yes, men and members of the LGBTQ plus encounter sexual harassment and misconduct as well, but women are still predominantly the victims.
Finally, let us observe this crucial topic within the framework of a conflict in a feminist perspective. The conflict on sexuality has been a long debate, and until today, the problem is still apparent and damaging to the society with its diverse members. Power, this and abuse on it, has been the central factor that brings up the multitude of risks any person could experience through sexual harassment and neglect of consent. By virtue of social inequality being linked to class and race, it is evident that people who often dominate in societies are whites, those with higher education, and those with higher incomes, all of which are the same groups that normalize the obsession over invincibility and possessiveness. May it be the context of our race or our social class, the problem of obliviousness within the limits of our dominance and competitiveness commonly leads to a violation of human rights. Primarily, it posits a struggle for human development and a hindrance to true and positive social change due to conflicts arising from the unequal distribution of status and power between different members of society. Issue more closely on the lenses of the gender conflict theory, it can be expressed that with careful consideration and an unbiased judgment, no gender is really safe from the harms of sexual assault and abuse, may it be men or women, or the other classified sexual orientations that exist out there. Violence against a human being is unacceptable, and the social inequality must be vanished and eradicated in our society, because the dynamics between the oppressor and a victim of sexual coercion is undeniably causing irreversible trauma and disrespect to the body and the freedom of a person. It is already a usual concept that shows how the perpetrators of forced sexual relations have the motive to achieve total power and domination, and so it turns to an extreme torture that taints on the victim's core physical and mental integrity. This is to be blamed by the gender inequalities manifested and structured in our modern-day society, as this toxic ideology promotes sexism, or the belief that there exist natural, psychological, behavioral, and intellectual differences between men and women, and that these differences justify the superiority of one group over another, where it is usually the women who are considered the inferior one. But never has this stratification been a constant, considering how men are also objectified and reduced on their value as a person. A woman's and a man's obligation is to evaluate suppress her or his desire, because intrinsically unlawful sexual conduct is a genderless and an unwelcome physical or verbal taunting behavior that is based on the urge to hold someone against their will through the form of discrimination, and although it is predominantly committed by males against females based on the history of this matter, nevertheless, it is an offense that could potentially be committed by both females and males in assorted measures.
I can't speak for this generation, but what I can say is that consent is now an important issue that is being discussed today. For instance, as evidenced by this assignment of yours, there are many issues associated with the concept of consent, including rape, sexual harassment, trafficking in persons or TIP, and online sexual abuse and exploitation of children or OSEC. These are emerging issues in this internet age that people are now beginning to be aware of as a related or adjunct concept to gender sensitivity and violence. This is only discussed among students. People in communities, especially the poor who do not have adequate access to good education, are often the victims of rape, sexual harassment, trafficking in persons, and online sexual exploitation. There needs to be more awareness on prevailing laws because we have a good number of laws concerning these issues. The rights of women and children, and the concept of consent.
Sexual oppression is best to describe what the importance of consent is attempting to resolve. Because in the current era where people are engaged and are open to a once sensitive topic before, sex, it is imperative to highlight how permission should be accustomed into what the norm should look like at present, and the necessity must be encouraged to become irrespective of gender and unfavorable of one over the other. With feminism, still, we touch on the relevance of controlled power, for the willingness to stand in authority and block someone off from their dominance is the main key that will determine whether any consensual action is allowed to be done unto you. Because if one chooses to stay submissive and keep their peace in fear of having been hurt or humiliated for not agreeing to a proposal done towards you, the exploitation will only continue and worsen through time. Therefore, toppling down the established standards of patriarchy and silencing of women is crucial and essential, as a society should aim to serve equality and everyone's identity and worth as a rational human being through a concrete basis of how to express your consent towards another person who could have possibly have different motives behind their desire over a person. Sexual violence is detrimental to lives, and these predatory behaviors must be restricted through constituting the need to acknowledge a person's consent before any action is done, because this only goes to avoid having someone be pushed into an abusive act that ignores one decision, whether they fully let the person be connected with them on a more intimate level or not. Society ultimately needs to change the image of what consensual sex should be, to reinforcing more awareness and education on it, and also empowering those who've had experienced the suffering of going through painful and threatening encounters of subordination. Because the improvement this builds majorly contributes to the endeavor of feminism to substantially equalize the rights between all genders and making sure that everyone could receive the exact same degree of treatments, opportunities, and benefits throughout all circumstances.
Definitely, yes. These things happen to children who don't even know what sex is or what consent is. It is a huge help in a way that it can be prevented to someone who is fully aware of these issues. Will we wait for more seen and unseen sexually related cases to rise before implementing solutions that will surely mitigate these problems?